Okay, I guess we've started and I didn't even realize it. So here we are again, and I'm hoping that the glare isn't so bad this week. I'm going to try to make this a lot quicker because last week I got kind of carried away. And I know you have to read all the paperwork. So, as you can see, we're sitting in my bedroom and it's quite noisy outside. So, I'm going to try and do this quickly. We're on pages 99 to 145 this week, and this is week 3. Now, I want to start off with this whole reading, this whole section, these 50 pages, or really 46, is really about all the unrest that starts to happen in the country and the workers' participation in it and how, when they're standing up for their rights, what happens to them. So, we start off with bank failures. Now, this is going to sound a bit familiar if you're old enough to remember 10 years ago. We start off with bank failures. And then goes into slash wages. After the slash wages, of course, tons and tons of hundreds of thousands of layoffs. And because of all this, because unions were new and budding at this time, they just couldn't keep people. People didn't have jobs. They couldn't pay dues. The unions didn't have a treasury. They couldn't support them, and everything, as you will see as you read this chapter, just pushes the unions um, up against the wall, which I'll be saying in a few more minutes. So what this did is the people, the working people, were scared. The working people were scared. They were tired. They forgot all the people in the North. There was this whole movement after the Civil War to help support the South and help support all the newly liberated slaves. And all of a sudden, that was just dropped. People didn't have time to even think about that. They were all thinking about how they're going to eat, what they're going to do. And so the recently freed uh, slaves were kind of left to their own devices. It's kind of like, well, you're going to have to um, make it on your own. And that's a really good topic if you're going to study Black studies, if you study what happened after the Civil War and how people got elected to office and how then laws were passed to get them out of office. But that's a different story again. That's Black history. So once again, because of what was going on, because there's a lot of struggle and fights and violence in this reading this week. And because of that, the term communism rises again. And I urge you to look up the term communism, look up the term socialism, look up the definition of democracy, and see how much difference there is, or is there. Okay, so the workers are frustrated, and they take it out when the railroads start their cutbacks. So if we start like on page 101 to 104, and you can read about what was going on at the railroads, and the very factor that they had. Businesses had so much money even back then. This is not a new situation we're going through now. Business had so much money even back then that they could pretty much put the president, who they called at that time his fraudulency, because he was busted. Grant had all kinds of issues going about him, all the corruption that was going in when he was president. Then they bring in the next president, and he's bought lock, stock, barrel by the railroad company and the other big corporations. And still, even with him coming in, there's issues that are raging on at the railroads because the railroads are cutting things back. They're pushing the employees to fight back because they're taking away their wages. They're cutting them down to 2 or 3 days a week with the slash wages. So you're losing not just 2 days or 3 days of work. You're losing that plus your benefit. Everything's been cut. No benefits. Sorry, no benefits. So what did the railroad businesses do? Who did they hire? And here we go into the security guards again. So that's all on page like 104 or 105 to 108. And did they get help from the government? You bet your sweet bibby they did. So the government comes in and is helping the railroads. So who elects the government? Workers elect the government. So how come when something like this happens, they go in on the side of corporations? Because it tells you who really has the power. But we're looking at this. So now we move to page 111. As the railroads keep up their tactics, what is happening, and why did one worker say when he refused to pick up, I think it was like an extra train or take over somebody else's job. And this is on page 111. He says, it's a question of bread or blood, and we're going to resist. If I go to the penitentiary, I get bread and water, and that's about all I'm getting right now. So that tells you where people were. Basically, their backs were against the wall. They had nowhere to turn, and the only thing they could do was to fight for themselves and their families. So that moved them on. So then we move on, and if you move on to page like 112, we're talking about what's going on in Pittsburgh and other states, but especially in Pittsburgh because you have the railroads there. And how did this situations here cause the deaths of women and children, not just strikers and not just people who are parading against these places, but women and children are murdered by the police, our government, things like that. On page 114, excuse me, last time I was so dry. On page 114, we come to the Great Strike of 1877. This was up until that time the biggest strike that ever happened in the United States. So, what chain reaction did this start? And then we even moved down to longshoremen in Galveston, Texas. And the Galveston, Texas longshoremen bring together two groups of people that up until that point people said it wouldn't happen. And today we still wonder. But it happened. So what happened there? And all of this fighting back, this violence, where the police are beating people up or shooting them and people start to fight back. All of this created in the media, in the government, with capital, that's big business, created this fear that the revolution was at hand in the United States, that the workers were going to rise up like they did in Paris and kick out the government and take over. So there's so many horrific examples of how our government um, behaved in an un-American way to the working people or the people of the country in this short reading of 46 pages. Especially, so then along comes, because all this is going on, people are starting to go, maybe we need to form our own party. So the Working Men's Party is formed. And the Working Men's Party is hoping to organize um, their own political party and put people in that they want into the government because obviously it's not working. And one of the biggest participants of this, sorry, is Albert Parsons. And if you read about Albert Parsons, he's a very interesting character, ex-Confederate soldier. You'll read about it. It's really great reading. And his wife, who is also a great person to study, Lucy Parsons. They're kind of like co-revolutionaries together. She is really an interesting person to study, even after what you read in the last thing that happens in this reading today or this week. Parson joins the Knights of Labor, so he's really getting active. He's an intellectual. I think he was an officer in the Confederate Army. He became the head of the Council of Trade and Labor Unions in Chicago. So this guy was a mover and a shaker. He also was a writer. And he had a buddy whose name was August Spies. What's a great name, huh? August Spies. And those two came together. Spies was a writer, ran a newspaper, and they started sending out information to the working people in working people newspapers, giving a heads up of what's going on. They were anarchists, and they were the anarchist group within the Socialist Party. And anarchists basically believed, and this is the IWW2, which I guess you'll be reading more about in the future. The IWW, the Socialist Workers Party, anarchists believe that to negotiate with capital is basically to be losing because you know that what they're doing is wrong and yet you're negotiating with them. So you've already given in, you've already lost. So it's to condone the wrongs of the system. That's what anarchists basically believe. It's a belief, and they believe that all governments um, are built on violence and that the violence is wrong and unnecessary. And then you'll read a little bit about Sacco and Vanzetti on page 137. And when I was going to college, I think I wrote several papers on Sacco and Vanzetti. And so I find that very interesting. There's not much in this book about Sacco and Vanzetti. You may find more in another book. I've written a couple other ones, but this one is, where you go right there. So it says, From the Folks Who Brought You the Weekend. And this book is by Priscilla Morallo and A.B. Chitty. And its illustrations are by Joe Sacco. So maybe he's a relative of Sacco and Vanzetti. All right, we move on to all the unrest that so many that was going on everywhere, that it really gave people a belief and not a hope. They weren't hoping anymore that there'd be a revolution. People thought the revolution was around the corner, kind of like we did in the 70s. But they really thought the revolution was around going on in the corner because there was disruption, violence, workers, everyday people fighting back corporations, fighting against the police, the Pinkertons, all the security people, the soldiers, the National Guard, all over the country. On page 137, they believed this because more police security forces were killing people and more people were fighting against this. Next comes the Mccormick Strike, and this is a really big deal also in the history of the labor movement. This was in 1885, and this helped support the belief because people burned the trains, they took them over, they kept the scabs away. However, the mayor, who up until that time was supportive and more of a left wing, more of a socialist leaning person, called out the the toughest cop in town who didn't care, who just cracked heads, shot people. That was it, in order to maintain peace, except that peace was to maintain what works best for capital. And now, after this, on page 140, we come from the very first Labor Day. Why was there a first Labor Day? What was the first Labor Day about? Where was it held? That's one of your forum questions. So it starts on page 144. In 1886, I think it was on a Tuesday, not on a Monday, because we make everything convenient for the corporations. You know, you're shut down on Saturday, Sunday, so Labor Day becomes on a Tuesday. I mean on Monday, because then you don't have to turn the heat on and all that stuff. And that makes some sense, especially environmentally. So Labor Day was initially on a Tuesday. And Labor Day was basically in support of the 8-hour day. And it was also a time where people from all the different types of organizations got together and they discussed what are the major issues that we need to be focusing on across the country, across the trades or the unskilled, across the different organizations, the different unions, that we can, as a group, come together. And there was parades of thousands in Chicago and New York and other cities. And these were peaceful gatherings. Now, right before that, you have the Haymarket Square. And this is also a very defining time in the labor movement. And I've posted at least one or two articles about the Haymarket on the website under the class page, under this class section, because what happened in Haymarket set the tone for what was going to happen to Sacco and Vanzetti, what was going to happen in the future across the country. And you'll be reading more about this disruption that comes in the next chapters. So I hope that was short enough for you. Carry on and have a great week. Talk to you next week.